Welcome to an impromptu episode of Talk Wrestling. Jimmy Frank. Jimmy's indisposed recently, but he posted an interesting topic today on greatest wrestling feuds of all time. And it got me thinking. And in order to define or come up with the greatest wrestling feud of all time, we have to define the meaning of feud and not misconstrue it with the rivalry. Now, a rivalry is when two or more are competing for the same objective or for superiority in the same field. They might not necessarily hate each other. They may be friends, but they're just competing at a high level because they want to reach a certain spot or gain a certain reward. And in wrestling, of course, it would be a championship of some kind. I think maybe a good example of a feud that gets misconstrued as a rivalry would be, I'll use this one because it's everybody will know, would be Stone Cold and The Rock. They are definitely rivals. They were probably the number 1 and 2 performers in the company at the same time. Some would say they were probably the number 1 and 2 performers of all time, performing in the same era in their primes. Did they really hate each other? I never really got that from on screen. They were just competitive. They knew that they were fighting or competing for the top spot in the minds of the fans and in the business. So I don't really consider that a feud. They headlined 3 WrestleManias, but I don't consider that a feud. Now, the definition of a feud is a state of prolonged mutual hostility, typically between 2 or more families or communities. And it's characterized by violent assaults and revenge for previous injuries. That definitely describes wrestling. And it takes part in a prolonged quarrel or conflict. I just think about that. My criteria for a feud is you have to have 2 sides at the opposite ends. And for wrestling sakes, we'll call it the babyface versus a heel. Excuse me. And it's going to have to involve hate. Something so dastardly occurs. Usually it's the antagonist, the heel, will do something so foul and so evil to the babyface, a betrayal, that it becomes embedded in the minds of the fans for a long time. These are the criteria. All right, let's think. Maybe even if if you weren't watching at the time because you weren't born or you're too young, when Roddy Piper broke the coconut over Jimmy Snuka's head on Piper's Pit back in 1984, and then proceeded to whip him with the belt and mush his banana in his face. I mean, that is an example of a dastardly evil deed. And then it was I don't know if they scrapped the feud or if Snuka really got hurt, but they tumbled over the ropes in a future match, and I think it must have been they just probably scrapped the angle, and Snuka took a tumble over the ropes. They both twirled over the ropes, and Snuka sold the neck injury, and Piper took a chair and came down on his neck several times. They said he hurt him, and Snuka was off TV for a while. And then Piper picked up the feud with Snuka's cousin, the Tonga Kid. But anyway, that's an act of a dastardly deed. You could take Sergeant Slaughter throwing fire into Hulk Hogan's eyes and blinding him, Or how about the Undertaker putting someone in a coffin on the funeral pole? Things like that. Well, there's plenty more. I'll get to it, but I'm just setting it up. And also, my criteria, it has the best feuds are when it gets personal. It almost crosses the line of kayfabe and reality. It's like a work shoot. You don't even know sometimes if it's real or not. Even the insiders don't know if it's real or not, or if art has spilled into life, or life has spilled into the art. We don't know. The lines get blurred, and the greatest example of that, of course, would have to be between you could say Hulk Hogan and maybe let's say Vince McMahon. You know, steroid scandal. Vince felt he was responsible for building up Hogan's career. He made Hulk Hogan. Hogan feels that he built WWE, and Vince wrote the success on his back. And then the steroid scandal hit, and Hogan testified, nearly ruined McMahon, and Hogan then jumped ship to WCW, and of course then he came back, and then they had a feud, but we could even say using the example of Edge and Matt Hardy, when Matt Hardy was dating Lita, and then Lita cheated on Matt with Edge, and they fired Matt, and the fans rebelled, and they were pissed, and they brought Matt back, and then they had the feud on screen, and it imitated life. So that's another one of my criteria. It has to have that personal feeling to it, that personal hate, where it captivates the audience, and the wrestling world stops to see this conflict and how it's going to end and what's going to happen next. Of course, also it has to be memorable and enduring. Like I said, uh, when something happened, when HBK put high kicked Marty Jannetty and then threw him through the barbershop window. Where were you? Do you remember that moment? And do you still remember it to this day? That was probably close to 25 years ago. Or like I said, Snuka and Piper broke the coconut of Snuka's head. There's more, but we'll get to it. The impact it had on the wrestling world at the time and to this day. Feuds like the NWO, you could say, versus WCW. Now, is that a feud or a rivalry? And also, which brings me to the next criteria, it has to be between two individual parties. I mean, we could say tag teams, but for the sake of this episode, we'll limit it to singles competition. It starts it's one against one, and maybe they could bring in other parties and characters and involve them in the feud as it prolongs. But I won't have, for this episode, I won't consider NWO versus WCW versus WWE. That's not what we're going to get at. That would be more of a rivalry and a feud. Which brings me to my next important criteria. For the greatest feud to be considered in eventually we'll get to at the end, the greatest feud or feuds is when a rivalry becomes a feud and a feud becomes a rivalry, if you understand what I'm saying, where the rivalry becomes so intense that lines are crossed. The stakes are so high that someone will do anything to get to those stakes, and it continues for a while, and it becomes memorable, and it is entertaining, and it is competitive, and it maybe might be friends or not enemies in the beginning, but eventually it unfolds where there's a clear heel antagonist, an aggressor, and a face who now becomes the underdog who has to fight uh, uneven odds and is always handicapped. Now, I said entertaining, impact. Sometimes the feud is so intense that it might even spill outside of the wrestling world into the mainstream. And they'll say, well, when did that ever happen? Uh, we could start back. This is a good segue to the early 80s. And this would have been hands down in my top 3 greatest feuds of all time. And I recently reviewed this a few days ago, and it involved Memphis. Let's go to Memphis, uh, the home of the king of Memphis, Jerry Lawler. And at the time, I know that I'm showing my age here. It involved TV sitcom star, and comedian Andy Kaufman. If you're too old, too young to remember, you could Google the Taxi. He rose to fame playing the character Latka. Uh, he was a wild comedian, comic. He was very bizarre, and it was only sometimes he did things that seemed only entertaining to him. He liked he got wrestling, and he loved wrestling because that's what he was very good at. He liked to blur the lines of reality and fiction, kayfabe, work, shoot, and that's what he was very good at. And if you watch the movie with Jim Carrey, it was a biopic of him. Andy Kaufman tragically died of lung cancer, even though he didn't smoke. Only a couple of years later, I think it was 1984. But this feud spilt from a small territory. It wasn't back then. They had territories, and Memphis was the main territory, and it spilt outside of this territory into the mainstream when the feud erupted even further on the Dave Letterman show. And you could Google it. It's rated one of the top 100 moments in TV history, television history. Since the invention of the television to 2016, it's still rated as one of the greatest moments in television history. And what happened was Jerry Lawler and Andy Kaufman, and it turned out it was a work shoot, and nobody besides Lawler and Kaufman, nobody knew about it. Letterman didn't know about it. I'm sure he had an idea, but it seemed so real they didn't know. And that was great. It was a long feud. It was entertaining. Lockett, Andy Kaufman came into Memphis as a big Hollywood star, so he portrayed himself. He wrestled in long johns, white long johns and shorts, and he was the intergender champion, a male who only fought females. And it was pretty funny. And he would get very random women, not random, but I'm sure they were paid. But they looked like shoot matches, and Kaufman would win at the end of the night. Well, until one night when Jerry Lowell decided to coach one of the women, and that ignited the feud. And Kaufman didn't like Lawler interfering in his business. And then, of course, Lawler got down the road. Lawler got tired of Kaufman's antics, and he punched him in the mouth, and then pile drive him, and then that ignited everything. And Kaufman wanted to sue him. He was furious. He was from Hollywood, and he would make fun of people from Memphis, Tennessee. We plow the fields and mow the farm. Duh. It was pretty funny. I did a bad impersonation. We gotta watch it. And I mean, it lasted for a while. And the backstory on this side of it was Vincent J. McMahon, Vince McMahon's father, uh, originally turned down the idea of Andy Kaufman coming to the WWF at the time because he protected he was an old timer and he felt that a non wrestler shouldn't be involved in storyline, and he was an old timer, and Vince Jr. would have jumped all over it. But anyway, so that's a good example of of a feud spilling out into mainstream. But the reason why I don't consider this the greatest feud is because it really wasn't as entertaining as it was. Kaufman's not a wrestler, and the feud eventually uh, culminated into Kaufman paying wrestlers like Jesse Ventura, put a bounty on Lola's head, and it it fizzled out. But if you follow that, I would have Kaufman wants to keep keep doing wrestling, but he tragically passed away. Uh, so yeah, that is not a criteria. Does not fit the criteria because I want the greatest feud to involve two in-ring workers, and that's another criteria. I wanted the competition. I wanted to have not only all the elements I've been discussing, but of course the sizzles in the ring. You could have all the, the gimmickry and the little things to start the feud or highlight the feud, but it all gets settled in the ring because it's called the wrestling rivalries, the wrestling feuds. So it has to be between two active wrestlers or performers, male or female. Uh, Memorable. We'll go in the '80s. A memorable feud I liked, where it fit the criteria, was Randy Savage and Jake the Snake. If you remember, Jake the Snake, he was he got Macho tied up in the ropes, and then took out the Cobra, and he made the Cobra bite Savage in the arm, and he actually censored it to put the X, and it was great. You had Elizabeth, Macho Man's manager and wife at the time. You see her crying. She's, oh my God, everybody's crying. They have shots of the audience of little kids crying and women are horrified and people are just really stunned. I mean, I think they defanged or they devenomed, whatever they did. I don't remember. Is the Cobra actually, if you can see, it actually locked on to Savage's arm, and he was actually bleeding. And the backstory behind that, if you could watch the shoot interview, is Jake Roberts, before they did the segment, Macho was scared. He's like, "Hey brother," he says, "Hey brother, how do I know that thing really, the snake really isn't poisonous or is going to poison me?" And Roberts hinted that maybe Macho was paranoid and Jake the Snake was going to use snake with venom to get Macho out of the top spot in the company so he could take over. So I think Jake the Snake made the Cobra bite him first in the back just to show Savage that it was safe. Crazy story. But I won't consider this the greatest. I can't consider this the greatest feuds because I don't. It didn't really last that long. I think they pulled the plug on it, and they had a good memorable match on Saturday night's main event. But again, it's not where it was a series and prolonged. Uh, Speaking of macho, this could be considered an honorable mention. The greatest feuds of all time was Randy Savage and Ric Flair. Their feud culminated in two separate decades, the 80s and 90s, and in two different companies, WWF and WCW. And if you remember when Flair first came to the WWF from the NWA and WCW as the real world champion, Ric Flair, after his initial bout and work program with Hogan, they moved on to he moved on to Savage, Flair versus Savage. And if you remember, there was the famous segment where Flair he came out and he was hinting that he had dated Miss Elizabeth way before Macho Man ever met her, and they had a long romantic relationship before Savage, and he would provide the evidence and the pictures, and they drew this out over several weeks. Excuse me, and you were hooked. You were like, come on, man, it's Miss Elizabeth. We've only ever seen Miss Elizabeth and Macho Man. I mean, God forbid they could have had a life before the WWF. But anyway, Ric Flair did provide the evidence in a segment on TV, and he showed pictures of him and Miss Elizabeth in various poses and environments, having dinner, petting a horse in the horse stable. And of course, there was no Photoshop back then. They obviously did a photo shoot for the WWF magazine and pushed it off as it was before Savage and Elizabeth met and got married. But that feud was intense in the WWF. And then, of course, when in the mid-'90s, when Savage would jump to WCW, him and Flair picked up on another feud. They had a memorable match, a steel cage match. So that fits the criteria of good and bad, and it got personal, kayfabe in this instance, and it was memorable with the pictures. It was entertaining. The competitiveness. You have two of the all-time greats. Excuse me. And it was competition. So we'll save for the 80s. Those are my honorable mentions. I didn't pick Piper versus Hogan because although it had all the qualities, and man, that should have been the ultimate rivalry of the 80s. I guess, as we know now, we're smart now, and in times past, that they just couldn't do business. Piper didn't want to lose. He didn't want to do the job. It was the number one face versus the number one heel at the same time, the same company in their primes. But and it started the first WrestleMania, but they got away from Piper versus Hogan, and it became more of the Piper versus the Rock and Wrestling connection, and the feud actually it morphed into Piper versus Mr. T. They actually hated each other. I mean, that could have been definitely a candidate for the greatest feuds, because Hogan and Piper had the mainstream too, but they had one really memorable match, which they aired on MTV when MTV was an upstart network. It was called The War to Settle the Score, and man, go Google that. When the heat Piper gets, he comes into the ring with the Hulkamania shirt, with his kilt, and he breaks the guitar, and he does the Jimmy Snuka I Love You sign. Heat, okay? That's what Madison Square Garden was so bad. And when you hear Hulk Hogan's music come out, the place goes absolutely nuts. That's what a pop is. And I'm not going to get off subject here, but that's what people don't understand today with Cena and Reigns. Oh, why doesn't the crowd accept these guys? And Cena, the fans are split on him. Go back and watch that. The war to settle the score. When Hulk Hogan comes out, that happens to him all the time. The crowd goes berserk. You can't even hear the announcers. And it's crazy. But, there's other, I'm going to get into this. I'm building up to it. And I want to do this for a while because I don't want to miss any matches, feuds, or possibilities. I'm sure I'm gonna, if you decide to comment to this or bother to listen to this, there's so many, but I want them to fit the criteria. I mean, we have, I mentioned Austin versus The Rock. I consider that a rivalry, not a feud. They never really did anything to each other. John Cena versus CM Punk. I consider that a rivalry because they were obviously Punk was trying to take the top spot from Cena. Punk outsold Cena merch, but Punk he held the title. He had the modern day record for the longest title reign in WWE as a world champion. But he still was placed in the mid card, and Cena would go in the main event. Blah blah blah. We all know how that went, and that ended. Like another great example of a rivalry might be Kurt Angle versus Brock Lesnar. These two guys, it's two legit amateur wrestlers, badasses, Olympians. I mean, Lesnar could have been Olympian, I'm sure, if he wants to. And there's a story about how on the road these two guys would go at it because they were so competitive. And they had that memorable match at WrestleMania where Lesnar did the shooting star press, nearly broke his neck. I mean, but I consider those rivalries. Another one could have been Flair versus Sting, but it was prolonged. But I consider that it was more of a rivalry than a feud, even though they did hate each other. But you never really saw it that way. How about Rob Van Dam versus Jerry Lynn? They're memorable matches in ECW, but they were really just great matches, and nobody ever really did anything bad to each other. They just competed. And how about John Cena versus Orton? Could you consider this a feud? I don't think so. Maybe. Right? Didn't Orton try to punt John Cena's father's head? But this was more of a rivalry, I think. And maybe it could have been a feud. I don't know. It just maybe I have a sour taste in my mouth because they wrestled us like 1,000 times, and people just got fed up with it. I don't know. I'm not going to count it. If you want to, but I don't think it goes into a greatest feud category. And some people are going to scream bloody murder, but Flair versus Dusty Rhodes, I mean, this had it all. But, you had the two opposite extremes. You had Ric Flair, Rolex wearing, alligator skin shoe wearing, limousine riding, jet flying, versus the son of the plumber. They fought for the championship, and I think it was more rivalry than a feud. I'm going to end this and make a part two, okay? So stay with me, and I'll be right back.